Good morning, everyone. I'm Tone Fløtten, the Managing Director of FAFO, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you all to FAFO and to this breakfast seminar on resettlement policies. In 2020, nearly 26 million people were living as refugees around the world, most of them in a country neighboring their homeland. And selected refugees are offered the chance to resettle to a safe third country, for instance, Norway. However, this is a very, very rare opportunity, as less than 1% of the refugees are resettled annually. And today's seminar is part of the Future of Resettlement project, Vulnerability Revisited, funded by the Norwegian Research Council. And the project was starting up this year, and it will go on until the end of 2024. And the main aim of this project is to study the potential shifts in resettlement policies, specifically related to the concept of vulnerability and how these policy changes shape the processes of how refugees are selected for resettlement. In the project, we will explore the selection of quota refugees from the camps in Lebanon, Uganda, and Rwanda until their integration in Norway. And this project speaks very well to one of FAFO's core research areas, migration and integration. As you can see from the sign behind me, FAFO is 40 years this year, and we have been studying integration and migration almost all our history. And we have many ongoing projects that explore different aspects concerning migration and integration. We are one of the largest research hubs in Norway when it comes to researching Norwegian migration bureaucracy, Norwegian integration policies and practices, and how people on the move experience these. We also have several ongoing projects on the international migration politics. How is it defined, and what consequences does the politics have for migration patterns and third countries? And we are also one of the few research institutes in Norway with considerable competencies on the entire migration route. We studied living conditions of refugees in the camps. We explore individuals' migration considerations. We do research on routes through Europe until they arrive in Norway. And as mentioned, we study how refugees are met in Norway and how they integrate into Norwegian society. How do they integrate into the educational system, into the labor market, and the civil society, as well as their living conditions as refugees in Norway. We did actually the first living conditions study on refugees in 1995. This week, the partners, or at least some of them, maybe all of them, I'm not sure, are gathered here in FAFO to a workshop. And at today's seminar, we have invited some of the project partners to shed light on different perspectives of resettlement policies from their perspectives. We will specifically investigate the concept and politics of vulnerability, and how the notion of the vulnerable refugees influences the criterion of which refugees that are selected for resettlement and who is not. And with this, I wish you all, us all, an interesting seminar, and leave the floor to Nerina, who will guide us through the session. Welcome.
Also from my side, a warm welcome to this FAFO breakfast on how refugees are selected for resettlement. And my name is Nerina Weiss. I'm a researcher at FAFO, and I will lead you through what I'm sure will be a highly interesting and educative morning. There is a great need for more extensive humanitarian intervention in a world where, as we heard from Tune, 26 million refugees were registered with the UNHCR in 2020. For displaced persons who cannot return to their country of origin or integrate into the country of first asylum, resettlement is the remaining durable solution. However, the solution is a scarce opportunity, as less than 1% of the world's refugee populations are resettled annually. And in the New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants from 2016, UN member states committed to strengthening and enhancing mechanisms to protect people on the move. UN member states have pledged to ensure no one will be left behind and to endeavor to reach the furthest behind first when pursuing the Sustainable Development Goals stated in the Agenda 2030. Displaced persons often lack access to essential legal identity, protection of law, and ability to participate fully in the host country's economy and society. They are therefore often described to be among the world's most vulnerable and furthest behind. But what does it mean to leave no one behind? And how are the very few refugees actually selected for resettlement? And although literature on resettlement is growing, we still know relatively little about how categories and criteria for the selection of refugees for resettlement are implemented in practice in what has been called the black boxes of bureaucracy in resettlement. Various studies have documented that from the refugee perspective, the selection process appears obscure, difficult to navigate and understand, and seems to be guided by constricting categories for the identification of eligible candidates. Vulnerability, or vulnerable but able to integrate, for instance. Legal studies have traced the regularization of resettlement through soft law instruments such as the UNHCR Resettlement Handbook, and found that the implementation has contributed to a form of legal diversity rather than homogenization. And studies that cover how the UNHCR and non-governmental organizations apply these instruments to determining deservedness among refugees for various forms of protection, including resettlement, have shown that categorizations of refugees is a spider webs of cross effects, where the emergence of one label in one area can shape the meaning and use of another set of labels in another. For example, the categorization of some refugees, mostly women and children, as being vulnerable and therefore deserving of protection, seems to correspond with the implied categorization of other refugees as dangerous and undeserving, particularly young single men. And as Tone already mentioned, Fafo is currently leading the research project, The Future of Resettlement Vulnerability Revisited, which is funded by the Norwegian Research Council. And over the next few years, we will explore the resettlement of refugees from a Norwegian perspective, and in doing so shed light on selection practices and the different rationales behind. And we will focus, as Tone said, on the category of vulnerability, one of the selection criteria, which has also received attention in media and public discourse. And we ask, what does it mean in practice to select the most vulnerable and leave no one behind? Who are those most vulnerable? And how is vulnerability defined in the different contexts and phases of the resettlement process? And we are really happy to currently host many of our project members here in Oslo. And for this Fafo breakfast, we have invited 5 scholars to present their ongoing research on various areas and perspectives of the resettlement scheme. We will learn about constructions of vulnerability in Lebanon, resettlement practices in Brazil and Sweden, and we will hear about new definitions of what it means to be vulnerable and thus eligible for resettlement in the wake of the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan. So we'll hear 4 presentations, and after that, you, the audience here, and the audience online in space will have the possibility to ask questions. For those watching the seminar at home, you may send an SMS. We will put the number on later on. You in the audience will have the possibility to just ask them here. So, our first presenter is Dr. Kamel Dorey. Kamel is researcher at the French National Center for Scientific Research, and he will present on the construction of vulnerability, the case of Iraqi Christian refugees resettlement from Lebanon after 2003.
Okay, so thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy always to come here to Fafo and present some of my works here on refugees. So the topic today that I will try to explore in the next 10 minutes is about the question of how resettlement have changed in the Lebanon policy since the 90s towards nowadays, and based more specifically on a specific period with the arrival of Iraqi refugees in Lebanon. So the main question is, when does the question of resettlement appear in Lebanon as a question for the Lebanese actors and for the UNHCR locally, and how was it constructed more or less as a political category through time, and with the example of the Iraqi refugees? So I will try to show how the 2003 Iraqi crisis, when a lot of Iraqis had to flee Iraq after the American invasion, led to a completely change of this resettlement question in Lebanon, and how the category was constructed both by the state and by the UNHCR. I just have to mention that Lebanon, for those who are not familiar with the context, is not signatory of the 1951 Geneva Convention on Refugees, so there is no asylum law, no real asylum procedure in the country. So the category of refugees as such, or asylum seeker, does not exist in the Lebanese law. And there is a long standing of Lebanese authority to refuse any form of permanent settlement of refugees on their soil, and it's written even in the constitution, and it's mainly based on the Palestinian experience. So Lebanon actors and Lebanese authorities refuse the settlement, the permanent settlement of refugees on their territory. So resettlement is, of course, will become one of the main issues after 2003. And just a small element on the specificity of the Iraqi presence in Lebanon, it's the vast majority arrived after the 90s, but there is, since the Armenian genocide in 1915, a lot of Iraqi Christians, and so present in Lebanon, who became Lebanese citizens, of course. And so you have churches. The Chaldean and the Artsirian churches are present since a long time in Lebanon, developing solidarity networks. So that's a very important element to understand the situation. So the Iraqi mainly arrived in two waves, after 1991 and after 2003. Well, in 1991, it was just a few thousand of Iraqis who fled and who arrived in Lebanon. Most of the Iraqi fled towards Iran and towards Jordan at this time. But a limited number of them arrived in Lebanon, and it was mostly Iraqi Christians, and it was related to the fact that there was churches that were able to help them to settle in Lebanon. At the same time, UNHCR opened its office in Lebanon. So the first time that UNHCR opened its office in Lebanon is related to the Iraqi crisis. And at this time, the question of resettlement was not absolutely an issue. It was not like present in the discourse of the UNHCR or the Lebanese state or even in different actors. The question was to address the question of vulnerability, but in terms with an economic point of view. The question was to have a humanitarian perspective on how to help people to live in a country where they have very limited access to the labor market and when they have no access to real permanent residency rights. So vulnerability was linked to economic situation and to a humanitarian issue, not at all related to any other different element. And one of the most important things was that the immigration process was absolutely not through resettlement, it was not existing as such, but was connected to the overall existing of an Iraqi diaspora abroad. So it was much the networks and mostly through different churches and institutions such like Caritas, Middle Eastern Church Council, that were promoting immigration and were helping Iraqi refugees to live. To leave Lebanon or to be able to have access to some humanitarian assistance. So the question was economic, humanitarian, and not related to forms of resettlement. And in 2003, there was a complete shift into the Lebanese policy with the arrival of a new wave of Iraqi refugees. And there was a memorandum of understanding, an MOU signed between Lebanese authorities, General Security, responsible of foreigners in Lebanon, and the UNHCR. And this MOU clearly stated, I would just quote a sentence, Lebanon does not consider itself to be a state of refuge, and that the only durable solution for refugees registered within UNHCR is their resettlement in a third country. So resettlement appears in the 2003 policy as the only solution for refugees in Lebanon. So Lebanon does not accept the permanent settlement of refugees on its territory and promote the idea of resettlement. So from an idea of a humanitarian category that will help refugees and to assist refugees in need, it completely shifts from an idea that it's a policy promoted by the local authorities to resettle as much as they can the refugees from Lebanon to third countries, meaning that UNHCR will play a crucial role in the resettlement process, and that the states who will who will accept the refugees will play also a crucial role in who will be selected and who will be considered as eligible for a resettlement procedure. So we had a complete change in the Lebanese policy, and at the same time, the number of resettled persons was very limited. So it's around a few thousand of people from Lebanon, and because people were also resettled from Jordan and from Syria at this time. And so the concept of vulnerability completely changed. It was not anymore an economic situation, because a lot of poor Iraqis were not included in this resettlement procedure, and it shifted around three different elements. First, it was a shift towards protecting, towards helping poor or refugees in need, towards protecting people in danger. And so the question was a shift that Christians were considered with the rise of Al-Qaeda, especially in the northern part of Iraq and in certain part of Baghdad, that there was a need to protect the Christians as such. So there was an emphasis put on the Christians. Also, the EU states played a crucial role promoting, and you know that France is like a protection, right, as a protection of the Christians in the Middle East. So there was also a pressure from the host state to promote the emigration of the Christians. And so the other were left behind. And there was a big lobbying of churches also inside the Middle Eastern country, and more specifically in Lebanon, to promote the immigration of the Christian refugees. So there is a complete shift from a humanitarian perspective towards a completely political perspective that is constructed by different actors. And UNHCR was one of the one who was just, going through this procedure and had to adapt between humanitarian and the need of protection and the pressure of these different actors. And what is interesting is that when this vulnerability completely changed into its definition, that it left behind some other groups, and mostly when I did some interviews at this time, a lot of Christian Iraqis who arrived in the 90s and were not registered within UNHCR cannot benefit from this. So they were like the good political category, but they were not like connected and not included in these programs just because they were not registered within the UNHCR. And of course, the largest group who was non-Christian Iraqi, because Iraqi Christians are just a limited number of a small proportion of the Iraqi population, were excluded mostly of this process. So it's interesting to see when the construction of a category becomes highly political, it has a huge impact on the way people are resettled. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Kamal. Our next paper is presented by Leonardo Scioccat. Leo is a researcher at the Austrian Academy of Science, and his presentation is called Palestinian Refugees in Brazil, Between Nations and Humanitarian Tutelage.
Good morning, everyone. In 2007, sorry. Good morning again, everyone. So in 2007, a group of Palestinian refugees moved from Iraq to Brazil, following a resettlement plan involving the UNHCR, the Brazilian government, and the civil society, including international NGOs. In my study, I highlight some of the experiences of Palestinian refugees and established diaspora in relation to this plan, while assessing the way the Brazilian nation-state navigated its political meanders and questioning broad assumptions about humanitarianism. An important component of the Brazilian development project during the Workers' Party years had been to increase visibility in international politics. This new international orientation, in turn, led to international humanitarian action. The resettlement plan discussed here unfolded within this larger context, and more specifically, that of Brazil's interest in securing a permanent seat in the UN General Security Council. My work argues that the Brazilian state treated the refugees as migrants and expected them to integrate, just as previous Arab migrants had done so in the late 19th century and 20th century. And it makes a case for the concept of tutelage to account for how humanitarian reason and intervention relate to refugee vulnerability and protection. Michel Agier had noted that the world's refugees are undesirable. He states, "They are at the end of the day undesirable, kept apart from the world. They are the very figure of the detestable liminality." Yet, the following story concerns a slightly different category of people, for the group coming from Iraq was outcasted among such undesirables. The resettled Palestinians were a group of 117 refugees who left Iraq for Brazil in 2007 due to the war. Among them were men, women, and children of all ages. Many of the adults worked for the Iraqi government bureaucracy, at least at some point. Prior to coming to Brazil, almost all of them were temporarily lodged in Raweshid, a refugee camp in the Jordanian desert close to the border with Iraq. There, they had already developed a reputation for being undesirable and unfit for refuge elsewhere, even in comparison to other local refugees. They were among the last to find refuge prior to the camp's closure. Once in Brazil, they were again deemed undesirable, only this time due primarily to a mythical national narrative. This double rejection of being outcast among the undesirables has worked against this Palestinians' perceived integration. Through the lenses of this double rejection, I discussed the principles of integration and tutelage, putting the supposed political character of humanitarianism into perspective and showing how mythical ideological notions of Brazilianness also help to reinforce and reproduce stereotypes associated with Palestinians. The story unfolded like this. After the fall of Saddam Hussein, many refugee camps started to form in Iraq. These camps received refugee groups from diverse ethnicities and religions and vulnerable due to various political reasons. The refugees were Sunni, Shia, and Christian Iraqis. There were also Iranians, Kurds, Sudanese, and Palestinians, among other minorities historically living in Iraq at the time of the war. Raweshid was located in the Jordanian desert, close to the Iraqi border, as I mentioned, and the camp was created in 2003 specifically to receive refugees from all other camps and to serve as a transitional point between Iraq and the resettlement countries. In 2007, the UNHCR aimed at closing Raweshid and resettling all its population. To that end, a triage procedure was set up in Raweshid, and countries such as the United States, Sweden, Australia, and others participated. Each potential host country interviewed the camp residents and decided which ones should be selected for resettlement in their territory. A group of Palestinian refugees, mostly originally from Gaza and having ties to the Iraqi bureaucracy, as I said, a few of which were also considered vulnerable due to old age and illness, remained rejected by all potential host countries. After the triage process, the UNHCR struck a deal with Brazil and Chile to receive this group of outcasts. Representatives of CONARE, the Brazilian government's agency for refugees, arrived in Raweshid telling these Palestinians that they were already Brazilian, but they didn't know that yet. They showed videos of Brazilian riches, oil, the megalopolis like Rio and São Paulo, dancing mulatas, fruits, beaches, and more. They promised citizenship, and even then a few refugees hesitated. Some of them did not want to go to non-Muslim countries, others didn't want to buy the propaganda and wanted to go where they actually thought they would have more chance in life. And others yet wanted to join relatives in Europe and the United States. But they were given no choice, and the group of Palestinians who landed in Brazil was the last to leave Raweshid. These undesirables went to Brazil because no other country accepted them, and many only did so because that decision was imposed on them. The humanitarian discourse mobilized both by the UN and the Brazilian government not only qualified these refugees as being incapable of autonomous decision, but also denied them the right to desire, for example, to be sent to another country, and to resent the humanitarian agents, for example, for sending them to Brazil. Some of these refugees' ideas about Brazil contrasted greatly with the state's official narrative, which was based on a mythical heroic description of the nation, of its potentialities, and its natural and social riches. But it was not long until some of them would be again deemed undesirable in Brazil, for they would be incapable of integrating. According to this rhetoric, refugees should not complain about what they're given, and that in Brazil, a nation of immigrants, everyone fits neatly, and if they don't, it's due to their culture and intransigence. This way, the humanitarian agents frequently spoke to me of the resettlement project as a favor. The benefit was not inclusion through national citizenship at first, but protection through tutelage, which in turn implies the non-recognition of the autonomy of the subjected, who becomes then object of the humanitarian policies. In this model, there are only those who are eternally recipients and those who are eternally givers. Consequently, the relationship between these two terms is always unilaterally asymmetrical, and the recipients are always bound to the giver's favor. Accordingly, once in Brazil, the Rauweischert group discovered that Brazilian citizenship was not unconditional, automatic, and uninterested. It was rather something that they would have to deserve in the eyes of the Brazilian government. Far from a gift, the logic was closer to of a Weberian Protestant ethics, meaning a price only to those who were able to demonstrate their successful efforts in integrating and overcoming inherent difficulties. What integration meant, however, was very elusive. In theory, integration loosely meant to be able to fit Brazilian society, and almost every resettlement agent had an opinion on the matter. In practice, CONARE officially decided who would become integrated, and thus who deserved to gain permanent status in Brazil, on an individual basis grounded on relative criteria such as personal sympathies, and especially display of non-confrontational behavior towards the resettlement agents, the project itself, and all levels of Brazilian authority. Nevertheless, a discourse recognizing the authoritative character of tutelage did not always accompany the tutelary intervention. In fact, tutelage often came bound to critical discourse on the vulnerability of the refugees. These Palestinians were supposedly incapable of judging that their coming to Brazil was a unique opportunity, given the multicultural tradition of the Brazilian nation and the competence of the state in its treatment of immigrants. In practice, even the humanitarian agency proposed that the human, in the plenitude of its rights and duties, thus beyond tutelage, is only manageable within the parameters of the nation state. This view assumes the ineluctable political condition of the subject. However, it's also precisely what the humanitarian discourse denies by upholding the assumption that it is beyond politics and thus beyond ideology. Most commonly, the humanitarian discourse is thought of in terms of an ideological liberal notion of universal human rights associated with the politics of commitment to the just protection of those rights. However, the claim to transcend politics or the particular interest of nation states and other political actors constitutes the very substance of humanitarian politics. By claiming universality, the humanitarian discourse also claims to be beyond ideology. This universal pretension legitimizes tutelary practices. Humanitarian tutelage assumed the refugees' temporary incapacity to govern their lives on their own, evoking the transference of biopower or power over subject lives from the refugees to the UN and then to the Brazilian state. It was supposed to be transitory, ending upon complete integration. While integration mobilized this mythical ideological view of the host, in this case Brazilian nation, tutelage mobilized a bureaucratic regulatory apparatus in line with this view. When this refugees integration proved difficult, the rhetoric of the outcast among the undesirables evoked stereotypes of Palestinians as bellicose, unruly, and backward, this being the sole cause of the resettlement plan's failure. In this story, there are multiple layers to how vulnerability was mobilized through humanitarian reason and tutelage. First, the refugees by definition considered vulnerable, which justifies the national humanitarian order of the world and its tutelary practices. Then, there are those considered more vulnerable than others among the refugees, which ironically perhaps resulted in some refugees not being accepted by potential host countries as they would not integrate well. The same hand that casts subjects as vulnerable also casts them as dangerous. And even after the refugees arrived in Brazil, they were yet again split in a more vulnerable group worth of aid and a more dangerous group, undeserving of the gift of Brazilianness. Yet, by being denied agency, for example, to discuss the very terms of resettlement, both groups were mere objects of humanitarian tutelage and at the mercy of its judgment. Through a different prism, both groups were nonetheless considered dangerous until duly integrated, but both were in practice vulnerable, not just those who spoke softly and conformed to the resettlement plan. Refugees are not just immigrants, but forced migrants. Their permanence in a given host country cannot be judged by their capacity to integrate, whatever that word means in practice. Yet in this case, they were expected to conform to an idealized view of those who had left their countries voluntarily to live in Brazil many, many decades ago. At the same time, they were kept under tutelary control, their voices rarely heard. Rather than treating the refugees as active subjects of their own lives, the resettlement process muted the refugees' voices. While this paradox was evidenced by the Brazilian case, it is by no means solely a Brazilian problem. Rather, it's a broader issue relating to the encounter between the national order of the world and humanitarianism at large. Thank you.
Thank you, Leo. Next ones out are Adèle Gagnaire and Ingen Bjørkhaug. Adèle is assistant professor at Laval University, Quebec in Canada, and Ingen is a researcher at FAFO. And the two will present a paper, The Shifting Geopolitics of Vulnerability, is the protection of skilled Afghan women a turning point in resettlement?
Thank you very much, Nerina. So our paper focuses on the evacuation that occurred from Afghanistan after the takeover of the Taliban in August 2021, which we can consider as unprecedented, this evacuation in scope, speed and scale. So as you can see on the slide, 120,000 Afghans were evacuated from Afghanistan after the takeover in 2 weeks. And you have a picture, if you remember how this was at the time, so of thousands and thousands of Afghans wanting to flee, and it was very complicated. There was a lack of flight, and then many of them were transferred to transit countries, etc. In this context, there was a focus on protecting skilled women, and that were seen as in danger because of their skills in Afghanistan. So during the occupation of the Americans and other allied nations, there had been a focus on educating women, and these women had access also to jobs that they didn't have under the prior rule of the Taliban. And it was considered suddenly to be important to focus on this. And so we ask ourselves in this paper to what extent we see a shift in the protection of women and the transformation of the notion of vulnerability, which we are going to explore with the concept we suggested that we call brain save. Thank you. So evacuations are actually not considered by UNHCR to be part of refugee resettlement, so they consider it to be two different things because evacuations are done by other actors like UNHCR, and then many of the refugees who have fled are not assessed to be refugees yet. However, many of the people who fled, not all of them, but some then ended up in resettlement schemes, which is why we see a continuity between evacuations and resettlement. We also considered resettlement to be humanitarian governance, and I want to insist on this because it's been explored in the two presentations before, with the tension between care and control and the lack of agency of the beneficiaries and the importance of categorizing them. So we ask 3 questions, and we grapple with 3 questions in this context. The first one is, what does the new focus on skills mean for the dominant framing of women as vulnerable in resettlement? And I will go on this on the next slide. And does the new focus challenge or consolidate notions of deservingness, which we've explored already in the 2 presentations before? And then what we suggest is the concept of brain save, what it is, and then what kind of advocacy argument this is. So what are the consequences of this new focus on skills for protection capacity and trade-offs? So historically, and especially since the 80s and the 90s, the focus on women as vulnerable has been on them as vulnerable because of their gender. So women are categorized as needing protection because they lack the protection of men traditionally, and the way that households headed by women can be resettled is really focusing on these categories of women at risk because of their gender. That has continued in the definitions used by UNHCR, for instance, UN Global Compact and other actors, and advocated for more support for the specific needs of women at risk. But there has been little focus in this categorization on vulnerable professional women. And so what if we start considering women as vulnerable because of their skills and their professional capacity and their aspiration in the professional world rather than just their gender? So do we observe a shift from weakness and really protection of need because of their gender to strength? And how does this traditionally challenges the notion that I just showed you? So now Ingun will show you examples to then go onto our notion of brain save.
So, to investigate the questions we grapple with in this context, we have selected 4 examples illustrating how this new focus on women during the Afghan evacuation is communicated in the public debate. Up. Okay, thank you. The first example is the Afghan robotic teams known as the Afghan Dreamers, consisting of high school students between the ages of 13 to 18. The team was formed with the help of the US organization Digital Citizen Fund, and they also organized the evacuation of the team to Qatar and Mexico in mid-August 2021. The second example is the Sohora All-Women Orchestra, consisting of girls between 13 and 20, and a group of US lawmakers, senior American politicians, and military officials came together to help the members of the orchestra to evacuate in early September 2021. But they initially failed, but later in the beginning of October, some of the members were successfully evacuated to Qatar and are now resettled in Portugal. The third example is the Afghan national women's football team. 15 athletes, including the women's national football team, were evacuated to Australia to help and they were helped by several prominent former sporting figures. And the fourth and the final examples concerns judges and women lawyers. Resettlement efforts for this group was largely driven by the legal profession itself. For example, the International Bar Association Human Rights Institute organized the evacuation of 103 women judges, lawyers, journalists, and other human rights activists to Greece. And some of them are now resettled in Australia. These examples illustrate how the frames of deservingness seems to be decoupled from a more traditional concern with victimhood to focus on skills, talent, and accomplishment. And the examples also illustrate the role of civil societies in identifying those in need for evacuation and resettlement. We argue that these examples are indicative of a conceptual shift, which we label brain save. Brain save is different from the more established concept of brain drain, whereas the concept of brain drain is used to describe migration from countries with short of skills and competences. Brain save refers to resettlement of refugees who are unwanted and perceived to be a threat in their country of origin. In contrast to brain drain, the concept of brain save implies a more positive association. It entails saving the competence of the Afghan women. The other concept we compare brain save to is what has been referred to as cherry picking. That means to select refugees of higher education and assume that they will easier integrate and participate in the local labor market. Brain save is different from cherry picking because it's not about picking refugees who are profitable, but resettling people who are vulnerable because of who they are, because their skills and expertise. A more concrete distinction between the two is that cherry-picking has mostly been related to top-down processes, meaning that they are picked because the receiving country wants them. But the brain save argument has mostly been a bottom-up argument, meaning that civil society actors advocate for this specific group of individuals to believe they are subject because they think they are subject to persecution and therefore deserves resettlement. I need some water. Just a minute. So, what are the possible trade-offs? We therefore suggest that education and skills and deservingness represent a new advocacy argument. 2 minutes, yeah. In refugee resettlement. But if the emphasis on capacity and skills is coupled with a failure to expand resettlement slots significantly, the burden on refugee hosting countries will increase. One trade-off can be that this shift can be an added burden on women who are already selected to be resettled under traditional vulnerability criteria, and they are now at risk of being pushed back in the resettlement queue. Adele?
Thank you very much, Ingun. So these are our takeaways from this concept. So what we say is that this emergent category of skilled refugee women can be problematic, but it can also create a legacy where women will be construed as candidates for resettlement equally with men, because it sort of goes beyond this issue of vulnerability because of gender. At the same time, gender now plays a role in discussions of brain safe, so this association with skills and protecting them elsewhere, and resettlement cooperation in the way that did not prior to the Taliban takeover, because also the focus on Afghan women before was saving them from this patriarchal society, and now it's more towards skills protection. And of course, the question now with this bottom-up process is, will the Agency of Skilled Refugee Women play a greater role in policy formulation? So a bit away also from the state with other actors. So we ask for a future research agenda on RACEF, can we apply this argument to other refugees and forced migration population outside of the Afghan women, of course? And what about the role of age, class, and professional networks in selection criteria and practice when we consider vulnerability? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adele and Ingun. We'll take up the questions during the discussion. I think they're relevant for several. But before we go to the discussion, we have yet another paper, and this is Brigitte Suter, which presents on the resettled refugees integration process in Sweden and the role of bonding and bridging social ties. And Brigitte is assistant professor at the University of Malmö. Sorry.
Yes, thank you. Yes, so my presentation doesn't deal directly with vulnerability nor the selection process, but it adds an input to kind of enable a hopefully interesting perspective on the selection process and the notion of vulnerability. So, okay, my presentation deals with the time after resettlement, the integration process. I mean integration here in a very broad meaning, seen as a process of establishing a new life after resettlement, which includes or can include employment, but also social ties, well-being, and other factors. So in the context of resettlement as one of the three durable solutions for refugee protection, I see the integration process as a key part of resettlement. So the resettlement process, I think, does not end at the border or after the selection process, but includes particular forms of reception and integration practices that refugees are confronted with. And resettled refugees have on average a longer integration process than other refugees, and now I'm talking about labor market access specifically. As a group, they have, or they tend to have a lower human capital in terms of formal education and recognized skills, and often also lower economic capital, especially when they have spent significant number of years in refugee camps. So in this case, social ties and social capital is obviously much more important than to establish themselves. And social capital here is understood as the social resources in forms of ties and networks and relationships that people can capitalize on in order to advance in society. And the integration literature recognizes the importance of social ties, but has a very clear favor for bridging ties for integration. And that would be the social ties that are established to people considered to be different. And in this context, it's often the majority society. But bonding ties, on the other hand, and that would be the ties that are formed with people considered to be similar, and in this context, often along ethnic and linguistic lines, are usually treated as less preferential and seen as one of the most important sources for segregation. So in this presentation, I would like to draw your attention on 2 points. And the first one is the benefit of bonding ties for the integration process, and that in 2 perspectives. And the first one is the benefit of bonding ties in itself, for itself, as a way of strengthening the self-esteem of people, as a way also of creating psychological well-being, to be in contact with people with the same frame of reference, thereby creating a stability that is needed in order to deal with the new situation. And also bonding ties as beneficial to create bridging ties. And the rationale behind this is that for some members of a network, the more resource-poor members of a network, bonding ties may be the only social ties that they can draw on and to engage with others. And then a network created through bonding ties that is in contact with other networks in society may often be the only possibilities to interact with other parts of society. Then the second point is the role of resource-strong individuals for the integration process of a larger group. And these networks members who create bridges for their group are often called the brokers or the bridge builders. And I'm drawing here on a study conducted in Sweden by myself and a colleague, financed by the European Refugee Fund. And these are some of the publications that came out of this work, and they're all online available. And in this study, we looked at how the time before resettlement, and in this case actually in refugee camps, impacted on the integration process after resettlement with a focus on social networks. And we selected 2 groups for that. We selected the Burmese, and they were actually all from the Karen ethnic group, and Somalis. Both of groups were resettled to Sweden in relatively similar numbers, approximately 1,700 within 12 years, 2000 to 2012. And both their socioeconomic situation in Sweden is also relatively similar. What was different was that the Burmese were kind of a pioneer group in Sweden, because it was literally the first Burmese arriving in Sweden, while in the Somali case there was already integration since the 90s. So I wanted to point your attention to the benefits of bonding capital, as well as to the importance of resource-rich individuals in the integration process. And for this, I wanted to retell shortly the main events in the formation of one of the biggest Karen organizations in Sweden, the Karen Swedish Community, or the KSC. So the KSC, at the time of the interviews, they worked they had 2 different objectives. On the one hand, they wanted to be a group together, the Karen in Sweden, both on the municipal and on the national level. And on the other hand, they wanted to create bridges to the Swedish society. Okay. Sorry. So it all started with one individual that was resettled in December 2004. He was among the very first Karen to arrive in Sweden. He started the Karen organization in summer 2005. In the beginning, there were only 20 people from the same municipality. It was really difficult for them to engage others. But then there was a person resettled that used to be in a leading position in the refugee camp. So when she came, she used to have a high position in one of the camps, and she knew almost all the Karen from there. So with her help, then all of a sudden they were 60 members. So they built KSC affiliation in most of the municipalities. But then the next kind of challenge was to access government grants to build an official organization. And that became easier than in 2008, when there was another Karen resettled to Sweden, and he had a university education. And it was through these person skills that they could start to actually formulate statutes that and meet other requirements that they needed. And also through this person's personal networks that they could access other resources. So one of the most influential was a contact to a highly experienced Swedish member of the Baptist Church who passed on invaluable knowledge on how to form associations in the Swedish context. So he helped them with the building of statutes, and he kind of educated them in how to build an association. And then after that, they could access government grants, and they had more, at that time, they had more than 1,000 members, Karen members, and then about 20 Swedish members. Yes, so my findings is what I already started with, that networks based on the sentiment of belonging can have a beneficial impact on the individual integration process, that ethnic social networks can lead to establishing bridging ties, and that skilled and resource-rich individuals are very crucial for the integration process of larger groups. Thank you.
Thank you, Brigitte. I would now ask all the presenters to take the floor again, and I'll open up for the Q&A session. So, those of you who have joined us online, you will be able to ask questions by sending an SMS to the number 46 91 07 18, 46 91 07 18. And for you in the audience present here, we have this amazing, nice microphone. So you just raise your hand and Selma will go around and let you speak. So I'm trying to sum up a few of the many points here, but so let me start with kind of vulnerability. That several of your papers have discussed the category of vulnerability, and Kamel, you have talked about the construction of vulnerability and how focusing on one group has overshadowed a much larger group with kind of all the legal and economic implications this has. Leo, you talked about the notion of the vulnerable refugee and how this is linked to the undesirable, the dangerous, because unable to integrate. And Adele and Ingun, we heard about how the category of vulnerability is vested with new meaning. So what your papers show is that what it means to be vulnerable, what implications this has, do change according to context, time, and where in the resettlement process we look at. And we have also heard that vulnerability is only one of the criteria used for selecting the refugees, and there are other categories. And among these, the integrability of the refugee. And we know that the ability to integrate is an important selection criterion in addition to vulnerability. But what does this ability to integrate entail? And as we've seen in Brigitte's and Leo's presentation, refugees at some point arrive in the resettling country. That's the aim of the entire resettlement process. But whereas the selection process may have come to an end, the resettlement process, as Brigitte has shown, goes on and over to a new phase, the integration. And from your presentation, it becomes clear that integration is at least a two-way process, the efforts of the host community to facilitate and the ability of the individual refugee to become a deserving member of the new host country. And I would like you to take up your last question, Brigitte, and ask how, if at all, do resources accumulated in the time before resettlement relate to the notion of vulnerability? I know that there is no answer, but I think we often tend to see vulnerability as and the selection as either in a group focus or kind of the individual qualities of one person, and what you brought onto the table is kind of the social relations, both before and after people actually come to their final destination. And I think this relational aspect has often been overlooked when we talk about vulnerability and integrability and focus on resettlement as a process. So if any of you want to kind of think a bit more about those broadened as a perspective on the resettlement scheme and selection. And
I can start. I don't have the answer. But yeah, because I was also asking myself this question when I planned for this presentation. So maybe I can just say a little bit more what we had our attention on in this research project. We were interested in the time before resettlement, the time in the refugee camps, and how, for example, mobility rights in and around refugee camps, how access to education, how access to or opportunities to income-generating activities, and how possibilities of self-organization in the camps, how this what kind of social ties building this enables, and how this can be then traced to the integration process in Sweden. So I think somehow vulnerability is very tightly connected to all of these issues.
thank you.
So, with regards to the Afghan women, I mean, the process is quite different because many of them left Afghanistan very quickly. So the whole step of being in a refugee camp, that also contributes to de-skilling and to losing a lot of social capital if you've just left, and you might have not had the time to reconstruct it in a way like leaders. In the Burmese case, he isn't there yet. At the same time, that was very interesting for me to hear from Brigitte's presentation, because it's likely that some of these women with a lot of resources might become leaders in the host communities with Afghan people where they arrive, or it might also create new tensions with established leaders in resettling countries. We're not there yet, but it's going to be interesting to see. At the same time, as we said, some have been resettled, but some have also asked for asylum in host countries. So this is also a different process. But for us, what's also interesting is the role of brokers, because it's really civil society that has been pushing, and all sorts of actors that were not necessarily involved in forced migration policy before, just as sports people in Australia, for instance. I lived before in Australia, and that was new to me to see that they were very involved there, meaning it's also creating new social capital that might also be beneficial for people with less resources. So this is going to be interesting. Thank you.
And what we also see then is that when you have a quota, when you have a selection of quota, you have to make choices, right? So that's the challenging part also that we're discussing, because as we started this seminar with, the selection of refugees for resettlement is an option for very few of the refugees that are able to be selected. And that's where we also see that there's difficult choices under difficult circumstances that are made in this process. Yeah. So when, and we don't advocate for one thing being better than the others, but we're discussing how in this process there are choices between one choice and the other. And the first one is not necessarily worse or better than the first one. So.
Yeah, I would actually like to take up your last point, Ingunn, because also in your presentation, it's kind of this light and shadow, and we know this from bureaucracy in general, that if you highlight one category and focus on one category, focusing on one would always mean excluding others. So it's impossible to be so all-encompassing that you actually can include all. So focusing on one, we had this kind of focusing on the vulnerable women, then would have, then who are those who are not deserving, undeserving? And in your presentation, it's kind of, it's a time limit, those pre and post 2003. So I actually would like to just highlight this it's selection. I mean, in the word selection of refugees who already have, it's a choice you have to make, and so there are regulations and there are rules and there are categories, but just also thinking of how focusing on one or kind of highlighting a particular group, what implication that has for all those who are not part of that particular group. So if you want to elaborate more on that.
Because that addresses the whole question that this project is all about, and that is, who are the vulnerable? And what we've been able to see now is that the vulnerable is not necessarily the poor woman in Africa who have no husband, no future. It can also be vulnerability because of who you are. But this is more a difficult way of perceiving someone as the traditional way of being vulnerable. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think that one of the points is that there is a kind of very strong link between the way policies are implemented regarding distribution of humanitarian assistance and the construction of all the humanitarian assistance in the host countries and the first asylum countries, and then the process of re-immigration or resettlement of a group of them. It's a link. I mean, so some of the policies are dedicated to specific population that will be integrated then in the overall process of resettlement. So probably the question is not only on the selection process when it comes to resettle people, but to have a more broad reflection on how humanitarian assistance is constructed and how categories are, and how do they contribute to construct categories of refugees that will be then resettled. So if you look at only the resettlement process, of course, as there is a very limited number of places, really limited numbers of possibility to resettle people, then if you look only on this very specific limited number of cases, then of course resettlement will be always a bad choice. I mean, it will exclude. But this exclusion is deeply related to what happened years before of constructing different categories inside these refugee groups. So when you exclude a group of refugees, when you exclude some of them, or when you you shed light on some different specific category, then of course they will be integrated in the overall process and then resettled. So I think that it's an overall reflection on humanitarian assistance and the way of humanitarian government that should be addressed.
Leo?
Yeah, thank you. So to reflect exactly about what has been said here and how we construct these categories, well, I guess what I would try to say in my paper in a nutshell is basically that I think we have a bias, we have an unspoken assumption that when you talk about vulnerability, we talk about lack of agency, right? And we sort of choose those who we perceive as having the least agency and we construct them as the most vulnerable. Yet, when we do so, that kind of justifies this politics of the tutelary practices, meaning that we end up not treating these refugees or these asylum seekers as responsible for their own selves, as people that we can actually discuss the conditions of the resettlement and the resettlement plan and those kinds of things. We just treat them as objects, right? And this is at the very core of the problem, because this creates resentment, this creates disenfranchisement, this creates all kinds of problems that later on would lead to what in the jargon, the humanitarian jargon, you can call something that is not integrated, right? And that's why I discussed this category integration in that same line. And so I think that perhaps what I'm trying to say is that you can be a leader, you can be active only to a certain point, because you have to show that you are vulnerable. That means to show that you don't have as much agency. And that it's not only when we're talking about the selection process for who is being considered vulnerable to be brought to a country, say Norway, but then is what they do here. Because if you speak too loud, then you become a problem. But isn't that, when you really, if you're a citizen, you're considered then to be able to speak on your own and to fight for your rights and to represent yourself. Isn't that something that we perceive as something good, as participating in society? But then whenever we deal with a refugee, it's the opposite. Oh, he's speaking too much, he's speaking too much. You know what? We give them a hand and he wants the whole arm. That the whole kind of snowball of these assumptions that we have about what means to be a refugee and how a refugee has to be vulnerable and how vulnerability means no agency, and we sort of keep them down, you see. And what we have to do is the opposite. If we don't want them to actually integrate, we have to bring them up. From the moment we start thinking about the resettlement process to the end.
I have a lot of questions, but I suppose you will have as well, and we have already one.
Yes, hello. I'm sorry I didn't quite catch your name. Was it Leo? You presented on Brazil. And I find it very interesting because what you're actually describing is kind of being a refugee as a discursive construct occurring within a larger nationalist frame or the nation-state narrative framework. And that's not unique to Brazil, of course, like you mentioned. I've worked with refugees as a volunteer in Sweden and Norway, and I come across it very much here, because what I experience is that at every single point in the asylum process, you are categorized as a refugee from the very first meeting with the police to meeting with citizens. Even your children will be judged differently based on your religion and skin color. And I've seen this happen from the very first moment when you meet a police officer. You are categorized according to your skin color or religion as either a desirable refugee or a potential danger.
Right. Yeah.
From the very first moment. At the same time, this is overlaid with the narrative of the non-racist feminist Scandinavia, where everyone is an equal and you are welcome and the possibility. Yeah. And for many refugees, this creates an impossible space where they can't even express their disappointment, their frustrations, their problems. Because like you say, if they complain, they are undesirable, they are dangerous. Right. And I see this as like there's this national narrative and this reality, and they do not overlap. And I mean, I've talked to people who are born in Norway who are afraid to criticize Norway because of their skin color or wearing a hijab, because they will be told to go home, and they are born here. My question is, you describe this reality very well, but is there anything we can do? How do we attack this problem? Where do we begin? Because it's such a deep narrative that seeps into us. Like, how do we break down this image of the dangerous refugee? Because it really causes a lot of pain.
I'm going to try to be very brief because I'm known to speak too much. So I would like you to consider that my main contribution as a scholar to you all here is asking the questions, is asking the uncomfortable questions rather than coming up with a solution. I'm sorry to say that, but that's more to FAFO and to all people to do, not someone like me who is like in academia, deep into academia. So what I'm trying to do is that I have my own limitations too. That said, I would like to think of my provocations as something that can help more than the answer, and I think that my colleagues might have more answers than I have. So I'll pass the baton to them.
Well, I think this is I think this opens up quite a large discussion about kind of the essentialization of the refugee, and I think we would then have to kind of think what do we mean, what pictures do we, what images does the term kind of imply, and then you go into racism, into it's a very important question, but it would, I suppose, need another FAFO breakfast, if no more.
I mean, my 10-second answer is you have to look at agency. You have to treat people as people. You have to sit together and think about solutions together. That's what I try to say all the time. But how to do that, then it's about the nitty-gritty of how to construct programs that are actually participative enough to do that, and how the society and the state can listen to feedback and so on and so forth. That's
it goes beyond. It goes beyond kind of the resettlement bureaucracy.
Hi. I was just wondering, based on your research, if you could say what are the arguments, because I mean the numbers of refugees selected for resettlement is quite low, right? So based on your research, what are the arguments for increasing the numbers? What are the arguments for maintaining the level and for reducing, based on your research and experience? That would be interesting to hear.
I mean, I can try. So first, just to make a connection between this question and the previous one, categorizing is an essential instrument of the modern state, but categorizing in the case of refugee dehumanizes them if they're not allowed to belong to other categories at the same time. And we all belong to several categories, so refugees also do. And I think it's important to see this. I mean, it would be better if we didn't have categories, but we do. So at least to use several categories. But to answer specifically your question, so as we mentioned before, less than 1% of the refugees are resettled. So I think it's in itself, we could say there is a numerical argument to increase this because all of these 26 million people deserve protection and a decent life. Now, we also need to put resettlement in the context of global migration, and I think it doesn't have to be taboo, and this is a conversation that needs to be had because migrating from the global south is extremely difficult. So for some people, you know, if you are looking to escape a difficult situation, the only category that will fit is that will fit in whichever scheme there is to resettle you. So I would say, you know, you have to think of different categories here. But in general, we also can see that welcoming migrants and refugees increases generally. I mean, you know, not in every place, but I'm based in Canada, and what we have seen in Canada, for instance, and I'm just saying this because not many people are aware of it. There resettled quite significant numbers of Syrian refugees, and the willingness in public opinion to resettle more people after the Syrian coming to Canada increased. So I tend to think that it can also sway some people within public opinion to support more resettlement, and I think that was counterintuitive, but that really happened. And when the Afghan resettlement happened in Canada, people were very open to resettle more Afghans. So we can perhaps also build, it's not valid for all cases, but in this particular case, to make a public opinion case to resettle more. Thank you.
Yes, maybe I would say that for two reasons we could increase the resettlement schemes. One is a political one. I think that when I have been based in the Middle East for many years and discussing with different embassies, European embassies, the question is that the position of the European embassies is quite weak in front of Jordanian authorities or Lebanese authorities when some of the embassies complain having too much refugees when it's just a few hundreds or thousand compared to hundreds of thousands in this country. So I think that to have a stronger position would be like to share, much more of the refugee flows. It would be, I think, a good idea in terms of political stand and in political discourse. And it could strengthen the position of some of the states. That's the first. And the second is much more based on a humanitarian reality. People are just, spending a lot of money for smugglers. A lot of them die in the Mediterranean Sea, die at the borders, spend years in refugee camps for nothing. And at the end, they just emigrate illegally to European countries and ask for asylum. So why should we lose all these years, all this money to control borders and to transfer migrants and so on and so forth? But at the end, it would have been, for example, it happens during the Iraqi crisis in 2003. Nothing was done. In 2006, there was a large movement of emigration. And there was no policy conceived before. When arrived the Syrian crisis, exactly the same thing happened. And we waited until 2015 to have a large flow influx of refugees by themselves. So if things would have been thought before and organized since 2012, maybe it would have been much better for the refugees themselves, for the host states, and for the public opinion. So I think that it's...
So the number of refugees being resettled is a political construct, right? So maybe there's a few people in the audience who has a say in that. But what we know from the research perspective is that as the number of people being displaced increase, the number of people who are given a durable solution for their refugee problem decreases. So the trend is that refugees go up, durable solutions go down, right? And that is one of the challenges we point out to. And resettlement is one of the durable solutions, but there's also two other durable solutions being repatriated or being integrated in the country of first asylum. And I think that it's necessary to look at all the three solutions together because it's not just about resettlement, it's also about finding a good solutions where the refugees are, and also to find a good balance of how we, as a receiving country, can also lower the burden, as we said, in the countries of asylum. But it's definitely one of the challenges we have today, and it doesn't seem to be gone for a while. So, yeah.
With these words, we have come to the end of our seminar. Thank you for joining us. Thank you very much for your super interesting presentations. I wish you a good day.